All right. So I guess we can review some of the stuff from last class, and then um, yeah. If you were to kind of answer what is classes and objects, can someone try to explain that? Classes and objects. You look like you want to answer it. Go ahead.
The classes are like which we used to assign sorry.
That's okay. It's fine. You can continue to try it. I think
Class is a big picture where there are many methods. We define arguments, and then inside that there are objects, where we have a certain argument and we help to resolve the method inside the class. So classes may be one of the bigger pictures and objects is one of the smaller. It just comes in it.
it's okay. It's a good sales pitch. But that's good. You're in the right direction. Anyone else? But it's still not convincing enough. Jishan? Because you look down. You're not looking at me. No, that's not the point. I think you can answer it. Go ahead.
So the class is more like a blueprint in which we put the objects in. Objects we can define the object as an object in the real life, like a cup or something, which has an attribute and a behavior.
No, good. What are attributes?
Attributes are like something, a quality you can say of an object. Attribute.
No, like you could say like a field variables, right?
Oh yeah.
These are representation of an attributes, and methods are kind of what represents your behaviors, right? And then we instantiate that object, and then you can have x amount of as many as you want, right? It's because classes are blueprint of an object. So yes, they are. You can call it an object, but technically they're kind of just a blueprint. And then when you actually instantiate it using the new keyword, that's when you actually create that object, right? And every object can have its own entity as well as they're all sharing the same common, right? So you can have an object that doesn't have a color, right? And you can have an object that has it. So not necessarily every attributes and every behavior needs to be used for every object, right? So, but that's good. Excellent. Good work. Okay, so everyone, try to answer these questions because these are some of those that can be an interview, right? Hey, can you explain? Maybe not to see if you know or not, but just to kind of understand you're on the right track. Do you know what you're talking about? Kind of stuff like that. So, I know I can emphasize enough like how important it is for you to kind of continue to practice this, continue to try to explain it. All right. All right. Raise your hand. What's an excess modifier? Mohammed? What's an excess modifiers?
Access modifiers we have 4 types like popular, Flickr, and Bluebird, and
Global. Go ahead.
I see public and global and private and protected or protection like that, because we put some variable whatever inside or outside the class, because sometimes we go from another class, we can access or we can't whatever, which if we put public, it just mean general. Anyway, you can call him and you can put whatever you want. But if you can protect private is separately on this area or in this.
But what's the difference between, I understand, like you say public, I can access it from everywhere, but what's the difference between protected and private?
Protected and private, I think protected is for only this function or this.
Not necessarily, but that's okay. Anyone else? What's the difference between protected and private?
Protected can be accessed within one class, and private can be.
No.
Private can be accessed within one class, and protected can be accessed.
No method.
No, don't guess. Go ahead. Let her give it a try.
Protected can be accessed from 3 different places, like class, subclass, and then package.
Good. All right. And then private is what?
Only
Only the class, right? come on, these are easy stuff. These are not the stuff we should be struggling with. We should be struggling with complex stuff, all right? When we're getting into like solving algorithm type of problems, right? These are the stuff you just want to kind of walk through. And the default is it's kind of like protected, right? Except it just cannot be accessed to a subclass, so that's fine. Review these guys, like when you go back home. If you can answer those questions, that means you need to review it, right? I know you know what it is, but if you don't explain it, that means you don't know it, in my opinion, right? Okay, what are getter and setters? This is an interview questions, right? I wish I can show you the questions the previous student has faced, and now is not the time to show you guys. But eventually, you will get hands on those, and you would see these are the questions some people ask, right? What are getter and setter? Go ahead.
They are things that you use to protect your data. And when you have restricted data, when you declare the variables as private, you use getter and setter methods to initialize them and also to get the value.
Right. So the way I can communicate it to my data points is through those getters and setters methods, right? You don't always have to have them, but if you need to read certain value, then you want to use a getter, right? If you want to set certain value, right? And today we will introduce to something new, which is constructor, and you can use constructor to set values as well. So in that point, you may not have to have setters at all points, right? So these are try to be top of those terminologies, and so it's going to be easier for you to explain it. All right. How's the homework? Did everyone submit the homework?
Yes.
Okay, so everyone? All right, good. We'll just kind of go over it real quick, and then you can kind of compare with what you have. And this could be done many ways, so long as you solved your problem. That's all that matters to me. As far as optimizing it, it will take some time. Well, very first thing, what we wanted to create is create a restaurant class with an attribute name, guest capacity, I guess guest counts, create method that tells user if the seats are available. So obviously we needed to create an class called restaurant, right? And there are some attributes that we had to have, which was, for example, your restaurant had to have a name, right? And then you had the guest capacity, how many people can fit into the restaurant, right? How many seats do we have available, so to speak? And then guest count, right? How many people kind of like sitting at a current, what are the guest count, right? So very first questions that they had, like, hey, I needed a method that tells me if the seats are available or not. Make sense, right? So what we do is we return a boolean here to tell us if it's true or false, and then we take the party size, right? So based on the party size, we're going to do some calculations and find out if the seats are available, right? So here, obviously seats are integer data types, and we say guest capacity minus the guest count, right? So guest capacity minus the guest count what pretty much gives you the seats left, right? And then we're saying return if the party size less than or equals to the seats left, right? Then that means these seats are available, right? Otherwise, it's going to be turned into false, right? So it's pretty straightforward. It's really not that crazy. So you first find the seats left, and then based on the seats left, you just do a little bit of a Boolean comparison here, and it will tell you true or false. So this will tell us if the seats are available or not, right? And then we had a method and these are similar to what we've done, right? Seat party. So we say guest count equals to the guest count plus the party size. So we use this to put, sit someone in. We use this to remove a party, right? So these two are pretty much identical. Is one to do the addition, other one is to do subtractions, right? And then finally, again, this is also fairly simple, right? Open restaurant for service or set details, whatever you want to call it, right? So you pass in a restaurant name and how many seats the capacity of the restaurant, right? So you set those two values, and yeah, I'm not using this here because the names are pretty much different, so that's fine. And then finally, you just print out the summary, right? You could have put this in a string and then print out the string, or you can just dump everything into a system out and it will pretty much do the same thing, right? And then if you test your code base, if we go back to the code base, right, we have a bunch of different code here. But let's unhook this thing. Right, you create a restaurant here. You set the restaurants, whatever, so bread and breakfast maybe, capacity is 80. And you seat the party, 78. If the seat's available for 3, it should turn into a false. If you remove the party, and then, so that should free up some space for you, right? It should bring back the party size to 74, and then you check for the party size again, and then you kind of get the summary, right? So in theory, something like that, if you had something closer to that, that means, you guys were able to work with these objects, stuff. All right? Any questions? All right, so let's move on to the next. Were you guys able to solve all these problems in the past? The sum of two numbers and things like that?
Some of
Yeah, okay. All right, that's easy. Okay. So the next new thing that we have to work with is something called constructors, right? And let's look into constructors. So constructors are special methods invoked when an object is created and are used to initialize them, right? It's kind of like a setter. You can think of I like to see constructor is kind of like a weird setter, right? What it does is whenever you create the object, it gets invoked automatically. You don't have to invoke it for, So now if we have to create call a method, we have to deliberately tell the code hey, go to this class and get me this method and perform an action. But with constructors, under the hood, it will automatically get instantiated, right? So as soon as you create an object, and that's what it's telling you, it's going to get invoked right away, right? Create and are used to initialize them. A constructor can be used to provide initial values for an object attributes, right? Well, here's the use case for this. Think about a required field. Let's say if you had a restaurant object and we have a method that sets the restaurant details, but that's kind of dumb, right? Because, you can't have a restaurant without a name and a capacity, for instance, right? Unless it's a takeout, but that's not the concern here, right? So if we wanted to force the user to set these details, we can pass that setter as a constructor, right? Those values as a constructor, so that they will run into an error when they create an object unless they insert the name and the capacity. Make sense? So it's kind of like a required field. You're trying to submit a field, right? But you can't submit anything without entering your required details from a real life standpoint, right? So that can kind of be like a constructor where it has to kind of be initialized and you have to set the data first before you can move forward, right? There are some rules around it, very minor ones. A constructor name must be the same as its class name. So the constructor name should have the same as the class name. A constructor must have no explicit return type. So constructor cannot return anything for you, right? So what constructor can do is it can only set stuff for you, but it can't return anything. But even with the setter, we don't really return anything, right? So, everything kind of going in the same direction. And so this is kind of an example of the constructor, and we can do this here, and let's try this out then.
Constructor name must be capital.
Well, it's the same name as the class name. So if the class name is capital, constructor name should be capital, right? So if we go back to our vehicle, and then we'll create a constructor here. Okay. So it should be a public, right? It's a vehicle. Let me see what they say. All right, so they're not passing any parameter just yet. And then we can say, you know, color equals to red. And if we go back to, let's just if we create, let's say we create a new vehicle instance, right? And say vehicle equals to new vehicle, right? And if I, let's say now, vehicle dot get color, right? If I run this code, what do I expect to see? It doesn't matter what the color
Can you
is.
go back to vehicle class? Red.
Right, excellent, right? So what that means is, well, remember we mentioned, hey, if you never set something, how can you get something? Well, in this case, we are setting it, right? If a user does not know how to choose this color, we'll choose one for them, so to speak. So by default, now you also have an option to override this, right? So if you say, hey, vehicle dot set color, right? So that now if you get a get color, it's going to override your initial values, right? But what I'm trying to say is that you have the option to override it, but if you want to take that away from the consumer, right, you can just kind of get rid of this. So by default, hey, in this company, if you're going to get a car, we're going to give you a red car, right? But just to kind of give you an understanding of why constructor comes into play, right? So make sure, that's how a constructor works. But it looks like a method, but then it also has to have the same name as the class name. It can take a parameter. We're not there yet. It can take parameter, but it doesn't return anything. So it's kind of like a hybrid of a method and a class, so to speak. So it's very weird. But again, I'm gonna run by the rules again. It has the same name. It has to have the same name as the class name. It can take parameter just like methods, right? But it doesn't return anything. So you can have vehicle or boolean or some crap like that, right? And say return true, right? We can't do that kind of stuff, right? So just be aware of those. All right.
This looks like void, yeah? Method void.
Yeah, but
Never to give
so don't put void here.
Yeah, but
right.
it looks like a void. The
Boolean.
void never to return something.
Void doesn't return
Same-
anything.
this-
Yeah, so
same
in this case it doesn't
Okay.
return anything, right? A vehicle method is a constructor of our class, so whenever an object of the class is created, the color attribute will be set to red. So that's pretty much what they're saying. A constructor can also take parameter to initialize attribute. So for example, private string color vehicle string C. So let's try this, what this they're trying to tell us, right? So we'll say string color, right? And then let's say we want them to pass in a color, right? We don't want to like give them a default color. So we'll say this dot color equals to color. But now if I go back to my vehicle, it's first of all, you're gonna get this error. We don't have a setter for anymore. But you also have an error here. You see this error, right? But you are familiar. You should be familiar with this error because we did something like this. Scanner equals to new scanner. You see how it's throwing in an error, right? So it has a constructor that must be passed on. You've been using it. We didn't go over it at that point, right? So in this case, it's telling you to pass in an object called system.in, right? And that's when it's resolved. The error has been resolved because it got what it wanted, right? So we can also make an object and force our other programmers to initialize a vehicle so they don't forget. We know that, hey, if you're going to get a vehicle, you must give me a color. That's the bottom line. Otherwise, it's going to resolve into an error, right? But in this case, I'm not forcing the color as red, right? You just have to pass in whatever the string is, right? So we can choose any color that we want here. It's kind of behaves like a setter, all right? So now don't go back and refactor your entire code and force like 20 parameters here, right? That's also not smart, right? So always identify what is the most important thing on this object. And if it needs to be required, then make a constructor. Don't force yourself into making a constructor because it's, whatever. All right. Let's go through.
We can you go with the plus? Can we put the two three parameters?
Yes, you can put, again, it's kind of, in this case, it's going to start behave like a methods. You can enter as many parameters as you want, all right? All right, so you can think of constructor as a method that will set up your class by default, right? It's kind of like a default method, right? That lets you assign something. Most of the languages has it, like JavaScript didn't have it in the past, right? But now with the recent JavaScript version, they also have constructors and classes and all of that. So you can't get away from that. So, once you go into the job market, regardless of what the language is, you're going to have some sort of constructors that you have to deal with. So you don't need to repeat the same code every time. Think about a scenario like this. When you're running your test, one thing you must have is the browser, right? So every time, let's say you initialize a test, make sure the browser is kicked off at least, right? So you don't have to deliberately keep saying, hey, object.open browsers, right? You automatically should just kind of kick off and do its thing. So that's one of the use case that you can think of, but there's many we can, think about when we actually get to that phase. The constructor is called when you create an object using the new keyword. We already done that. So a single class can have multiple constructor with different numbers of parameters. The setter method inside of the constructor can be set to the method. So this is great, right? What it's saying is that, hey, you can have not just one constructor, you can have multiple constructor as long as signatures are different. Well, here's the scenario. So public vehicle and then we'll just say color equals to red. So I have two constructors, but you can only use one, right? So that's where it kind of limits you a little bit. But in this case, we have a lot of flexibility now. You have an option to choose the color, but if you don't choose one for me, I'll give you red by default, right? So now if you go back to the object, right, by clicking on it, this is not being used, right? And this is being used. So you might have a case where people are using to set some value, and you might have a case where they're just, they're okay with red, right? So, or they're okay with the default value, right? There's a lot of scenario. If you look at retail market, right? You might have a huge inventory of some crap, right? And then, if people they don't care about the color or whatever, you might want to push that in, right? So we can have, obviously this is the Java code, but or we can have an interface where whoever's the inventory manager, they have an option to choose this, But under the hood, this is one way to kind of implement something like that. So push the stuff that is default, and then you also have an option to, give them the color that they want to choose. We always do that, right? When we go to Amazon, there are certain products we don't care what color it is or what kind of shape or what not, but they can only make so many, right? So that's one way to think of where multiple scenario comes in handy. Also, this is a great one. Think of a browser again. Go back to the browser analogy, right? By default, if user does not decide which browser to use, right? We can give them Chrome. Chrome is the most common browser. But then we can also give them an option here where they can specify a browser, right? Something like maybe Firefox. So now it will run test on Firefox, right? But if you don't specify anything, it will run test on Chrome by default. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with constructor. But don't go and just start using it everywhere, right? It can become pretty nasty if you don't use it the right places. All right, what else? The rules around it. So you can have parameter, obviously, so this is a good note. Java automatically provides a default constructor. So all classes have constructor, whether one is specified or defined or not. I mean, it's not really super important information, but if we go back to, like let's say you have a class called user, right? You might say, no, Mohammed, we didn't have any constructor here. Well, under the hood, there is a constructor, right? But it looks like this. That's literally what they're saying on that last explanation. So it's just nothing there, right? But without the constructor, objects can never be instantiated. That's one of the rules, right? But it's totally empty. It doesn't really do anything. But as soon as you provide one, Java does not. You're kind of overriding that, right? So Java does not provide any constructor for you, right? So it's just a piece of information to take, which may not really help you much. But that's pretty much what they're saying here in the last sentence. Any questions on this constructor stuff? Are we good? All right. This is a very easy one. So we've been dealing with an external class, and math is a very common one that we always deal with. You have to do some sort of calculations, or you have to kind of round the number to the ceiling or floor. I mean, we've done this stuff in I don't know, 3rd grade or something, right? But you don't have to know how to do all this calculation. That's the best thing about it. Someone has written this code base. You just have to know what that means and when to use it, right? So if you think of, if you wanted to find absolute value, let's say you didn't care about if it's positive or negative, right? You can just call something like this. And so let's try this one out. Right? So if you want to, and you can just call math, and then you have all of the functions that a math can do be available for you here, like sine, cosine, floor div. I don't even know all of those, right? So I think it's just, if you're in an industry where you have to do a lot of math, and I pray for you, first thing. And second thing is, it's you might want to just kind of leverage that, but don't go home and go crazy over this stuff, right? Know that there is a library that can help you with some mathematical stuff, right? That like a formula that already been written for you, right? So if you look at math dot, and you will understand in like maybe another 10 minutes how you can directly call them without actually having to create an object, right? That should be the question that raised in your head, right? Well, wait a minute, you didn't create a math, my math equals to new math, right? Without that, we were directly able to call them, right? And this is called static functions and static methods, right? And that's what we're going to learn in a little bit. But for now, if you wanted to access any of the math functions, you can kind of just say math dot and everything's available for you, right? If you want to read about this, just Google Java math library and it'll have all the documentation similar to our string library. When we study about the string and stuff, they have a similar documentation for math as well. So if you wanted to find out the absolute value of this, you can just do Sout A, right? Right, so you get 10. So even if it's negative value, you would only get absolute value, right? So it ignores the positive negative sign here, right? So and then same thing with ceiling. So you see how math dot ceiling is. So it's 7.3.42. Ceiling means it's like go to the next upper end, right? Go to the next number, right? That would reach, right? So, but if you were to round it, it will pretty much come down to the nearest whole value or nearest integer, right? So in this case, the nearest integer would have been 7, right? So if we round it, but we want a ceiling and we want to use the ceiling here, so it will reach to the next full number. In that case, is 8, right? Same thing with the floor. This is gonna come down, so you can force it, right? Even if the number is 7.9999, that's actually, if you want to go to the nearest one, that would be 8. But if you want to deliberately say no, that's still not 8, right? So no, you're still 7. So one of the exercises that we are going to do later is to build speed limit, right, for a car, right? If someone were to drive X amount of miles, right? Let's say if they have driven 5 miles more than the speed limit, we'll give them 1 ticket, right? But the 5 miles, 74 point, let's say the speed limit is 70, 74.999 is still not 75, right? So they should not be getting a ticket, but if you round it, that's going to be 75. So you have to want to kind of do, so these are kind of the use cases where you might want to use ceiling or floor based on your scenarios, right? This is a garbage one. Like math.max, you could just do greater, less than, right? But if you put 2 numbers, it will kind of find greater the value for you. Minimum, the same thing.
Just 2 number, or we can put 3, 4, 5.
I don't know. Maybe. I think it's right now it's just dealing with 2 number here, right? I usually just write code for that kind of stuff, right? But for now, you can try it out with multiple numbers if it accepts it, okay? And then you have math.how takes 2 parameter and returns the first parameter raised to the power of the second parameter. It's kind of shitty too, right? So it's saying like 2 to the 3rd, right? So if you want to do 2 to the 8th, right? So I'm saying like I wouldn't write it like this, right? We can write a little bit more deliberately on how we want it. But if you wanted to do this, so it's like 2 times 2 times 2, which is in this case 8, right? So if you say 2, 10, that would be 2 to the 10 power, right? So if you want to kind of use that type of multiplication, you can kind of do that here. So there 2 to the 3rd power. Yeah. So yeah, so it is the power value. So second value is the power value. So if you want to raise the value, power to that, you can use that. Again, you don't have to worry too much about this stuff, right? I'm just letting you know if you wanted to do some math stuff, or if you see a code base, this is how they got those values from, right? It's been inbuilt for you. But a lot of stuff are not. So even if you're in a company where there's a lot of calculations involved, like a finance or whatever, then you might have to write formula based on that company's formula, right? If you're really struggling, you can go into the actual code base where programmers kind of writing those stuff. I mean, you can get the formula from there, or work with a coder who's writing this stuff or who's figuring this stuff out. But a lot of those formulas are already written for you by scientists and stuff. Like if you're in trading company or whatever, and they will publish that formula, and you just have to kind of code that out for yourself. Again, there are a bunch of other stuff there: square root, sin, cosines, for all of those different things. You can find it in math. All right. So far, constructors, and then you have math, and then let's take a quick break, and then we'll go over static, right? Once we go over static, I'm going to have live a little early today. I left my laptop at office, and I have to travel tomorrow, so I have to pick it up. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you guys a classwork that's gonna be enough for you to stay, until 9:30, and Deepak will monitor it. All right. So that's that. But after the break, let's go over what a static is, and we're done with the signatures. We know every single word. Public static void. We're gonna know all of that means. All right. Okay, so the static is something. Yeah, yes. I'm recording. I know, that's fine. It's important that you let me know. All right, so let's get this started. Static is something that we have been familiar with for a while, right? So I think if we go back to our main methods, so what do we know about our main method so far? It has an access modifier called public, right?
Yeah.
It has something called static. We'll talk about that. And it doesn't have any return data type. It has a name called main. And what kind of data? What type though? It's array, right?
Yeah,
It's a string array data type that it expects. And that's pretty much it about main method, right? I mean, from day one to now, that's what we know so far. And we have covered a lot of ground here. But the last word is this thing called static, right? And that's what we're going to be finally identifying it, right? So when you declare a variable or a method as static, it belongs to the class, right? And that's kind of one of the confusion about this, right? What do you mean by the belongs to the class? And that we're going to try to clarify that, right? So when you declare a variable or a method as static, it belongs to the class rather than a specific instance, right? This means that only one instance of static member exists, even if you create a multiple object of the class, or if you don't create any, it will be shared by all objects, right? So it's a lot of things there, but it's like superly confusing, right? And that's fine. What we really have to understand here is that when you look at this color or even count for now that I added for whatever weird reason, it doesn't matter. These all belongs to a specific instance, right? When we talk about specific instance is, where is this thing? Let's say test runner. Right? We'll split this. Move to the right. Right, and then let's create some space here. So when you look at our test runner, every time we can access anything from a vehicle, so let's say a vehicle dot set color, get count, set count, they're all part of that specific instance that you just created, right? But what if you have a requirement? What if you have to have something that is shared for all vehicle, right? What I mean is that let's say I want to keep track of a count of how many vehicle that was created or how many vehicle that was sold, right? So that count needs to be kind of, outside of the bigger picture, so to speak, right? We need to keep the count outside of an instance, right? Yet that's still part of the class, right? It's part of the class, but it's not part of an object, so to speak, right? Because count is something that is shared across all vehicle. We need to keep track of the count of how many time vehicle was created or how many vehicle that was sold, right? So we're not saying how many specific object that was sold, but it's more like, okay, how many vehicle, how many times someone instantiated vehicle. Let's say if you have to do something like that, that you need to create it. Another example could be something, let's say a routing number, right? Let's assume our Chase Bank's routing number doesn't change, but it does depending on states, right? But let's say a routing number for a specific bank doesn't change. So it doesn't have to be part of an object. It can be part of the class, right? So every time you need a routing number, bam, I just call bank dot get routing number, right? I shouldn't have to create an object. As soon as you create an object, you're kind of trapping all of the implementations or computation inside of a specific instance, right? And that's something we don't want to do. So that's when static comes into play. If you want to kind of keep an object or keep a variable or a method, right, or keep an attribute or a behavior that is part of a class but not part of an object, right? I know it's kind of contradicting of how it sounds, but when you actually see this in real life, it will make sense to you, right? So right now, let's say I have a vehicle, and this is a good example actually, and I have a count. I want to keep track of the count of how many times this this count played a role. So let's say how many times we created a vehicle. So let's say we have a vehicle, and so we'll call it a vehicle dot set count to, let's say 1, right? And then you have, let's say, create another vehicle, let's say 1 equals to new vehicle, and then we create this vehicle 1 dot set counts to 2, right? But now I want to find out how many vehicles that was created, right? How do I do that? It's hard. I just can't, right? Because I don't have an option. If I do vehicle dot get, it will only give me this count, right? If I say vehicle dot, so if I say vehicle dot get count, and we can actually draw this out. This might be a good one to actually do a diagram for it. If I do this, it's going to always give me 1 because that count kind of trapped within that vehicle instance, right? We want to make sure that it is outside of an instance, right? So when we do this, we can do something like this. What we want to do is we just want to say vehicle dot something like that, and that should print out 2 for me, right? So it's kind of keep tracking of everything that's happening within the class. So let's do a quick diagram to make it a little bit more visible. right? So this is your class, right? This is, let's assume this is your class, and your class is a blueprint of your instances, right? So this is where all your private stuff goes in, right? So private, all your variables, right? Private field variables, right? And then all your public methods. So I can only access them by instantiating an object, right? And the way we instantiate objects is by creating a new keyword, right? Does that make sense so far? So what we want to do is we want to have more flexibility in our code base. What if there is a case where all instances need to share something, right? In that case, we have to have a static option, which is, it's not allowing me to write it here. Okay, I'm gonna bring this out back again later. So let's say you have to have, let's say, a count, right, for instance, and we can say public static account. So that's something that has to be outside of your instance, so to speak, right? So it's part of the class, but it's not part of the object. Whereas everything inside of this that are part of an object. Make sense? Okay, all right, you guys got it. So let's do an example now where we have, okay, so this is the example they're giving. So we have public class counter, public static counter equals, we don't have to use a counter, we can just, we already have something. So instead of having a getter and setter for, we're gonna convert this into public, and we use the static int, and then we'll use a capital letter for this, right? So it's not by default, you don't have to have capital. And then let's get rid of this constructor here, right? So by default, you can have a lowercase, but when you put, when you put all capital letter, the programmer automatically knows, oh, this is a constant value. This is a static value. This is part of the class. This is not part of an instance. Even though you can use it part of an instance, but that's not what we want to discuss right now. But right now we want to just use it as part of a class, right? So what we want to see is, and what happens every time we instantiate an object, what is one thing that always happens? It initializes the constructor, right? So what if we did this? What if we say count plus plus? So every time you create an object, well, wait a minute, I'm going to add 1 to it, right? So I'm keeping tracking of my count every time, right? So that's pretty cool. So every time you need a count, hey, how many cars did I sell? Bam, I just call vehicle.count, vehicle.count. So I can directly access them now, right? So when we go here, vehicle. Oh, this is complaining because, so you know why it's complaining? Because this became static, right? And these are not static. So only static method can call static variable. Make sense? Right? So because they both needs to kind of match each other, right? So therefore you're getting the error here, and it only makes sense if we go back to our main method, right? And if you have a variable here called string name, and if you try to call it here name, it's not going to work because it's not static, right? So if you had something called, and why it's not going to call? Because the main method is what? Static. So if you're going to call a variable, and then you have to have a static variable name here. So if it's a static method that needs to access your static variable, then make sure that both are static, all right? So that's one thing to think about. But let's get rid of these counts, because we don't need to access them. But now what happens is I don't even have to set counters, right? Because every time I initialize vehicle, counter is automatically being done at my constructor level, right? And if I want to see a counter, I can now have access to directly to count, right? I know it's a lot of information, but that's okay. If you, once you're practicing, you can figure this out. So we have count at 2. Make sense?
Yes.
Are we good, Deepak? It's easy stuff for you. So that's kind of how we can keep track of something like that. It needs to be shared across. So if you think of like, again, routing number, that is shared across all accounts, right? It doesn't matter if it's Reza's account or Vishal's account, the routing number is still the same, right? So it doesn't matter, like it doesn't have to be part of an instance, but as far as balance goes, that's different, right? That is pertains to an individual, right? So personal information can be part of an individual account's details, but again, the routing number is still that's different. That's same for everybody. So you want to ask questions to yourself. Well, at what point do I make these things static? Well, wait a minute. All accounts share this piece of information. Let's make it static, right? So don't go in and create all your objects static because it doesn't make sense, right? I think we have used something like that with arrays, right? When you do arrays.length, right, you kind of just directly access that. When you wanted to find out the length of arrays. And you notice if you're calling a constant variable, it's not like that, right? So when you have parentheses around it, that means it's a method, right? When you don't have parentheses, it's a constant value. And we're going to learn something called enums down the road, and it's a better way to handle constants later. But don't worry about it now. It's not that important. All right, any questions? Are we good? Mohammed? All right. And so the same concept applies to static methods. So you can have public static, let's say void, horn or whatever. But let's say maybe you don't want people to access your count, right? We can actually get a little bit better. You can say, let's say, well, in this case, I have to call setter. Let's not confuse you guys with this one. Let me just do this one then. So let's say you have a function that everyone needs to call, public static void out. You see how you can just directly call vehicle.count, right? And you can same way kind of just say vehicle dot, and you will only have access to those, right? But method should not be all uppercase. So that's okay. That should be your lowercase, right? Only with the variable, static variable, you're gonna do all uppercase. And again, that's not like Java is not going to complain that, but that's just the standard that is being used. So if you look at this, you can just kind of access it. But if you wanted to access like set color or get color, because since they're not static, they're part of an individual objects. So you have to access them through an object. So there's a meaning to all this kind of madness. I'm sure like whoever kind of built Java or any programming language, they thought about all of that, right? So, when you have to think about your requirement and then use the ones you need. It's kind of like your garage, right? You have a bunch of different tools. You don't use everything for every needs, right? So whenever you need something, and if you have to do plumbing, then you get the plumbing type of tools, right? If you have to nail something, you get a hammer and nail. So that's kind of how you have to think of like Java programming. It's a garage with a bunch of different tools, but you don't always use everything that you have available, right? But then there's common ones that are being used across all the time, right? So that's that. Any questions?
When you use the static, we must need to use the public, or we can use.
You can use private, but then you can access it, right? So that defeats the purpose. So I think static, if you're going to use static, most of the time it's going to be public. But there could be a cases where it has to be private, but not something that you have to worry about. Okay. All right. So let's do one thing. Let's go over the classwork, which can turn into homework, right? Because it's a lot of work actually, and Deepak will be here to kind of, ask any questions. It's like I don't want it. This is a very cool one. So you have to build a printer. Like this is a very common one for interviews as well, right? And all these questions, like I didn't like I wish I made them, right? It came from previous students and or something that we probably asked during interviews for programmers, right? And it doesn't matter what language it is, you still need to solve your problem. But you guys are doing really well. Some of you guys needs to pick up the pace a little bit, but some of you guys are doing phenomenal. So you know who you are. So let's say user can, guys. So user can set toner level range between 0 to 100, right? So think about, again, going back to if you need to use a constructor, if you need to use a setter, right? In printer, I want to see if you use some sort of constructor, right? So how many values you want to use as a constructor, that's up to you. But at least use a constructor on this exercise. So user can set toner level range between 0 to 100. Toner level cannot be greater than 100. So that's important, right? So you want to maybe put some logic saying it cannot be greater than 100. User should be able to see number of pages printed, right? User should be able to print both sides. So in this case, the number of pages calculation is different, right? Because if it's both sides, in that case, printed page should calculate correctly, right? So if it's single-sided, right, and if I print 50 pages, that's 50 pages. But if it's both sides, and if I print 50 pages, that's actually 25, right? If it's both sides, that's actually 25 pages. So I want to be able to get the count of the pages as well. User can view current toner level at any time. Let's say, like all those meters, it has some sort of a bar that tells you how much toner left and all of those things. Maybe that's the code that I want to see, right? I want to be able to see how much toner I have left. And it's kind of like your charger, right? The phone charger, and it has a value there. And based on the charge, it will tell you how much value that's there. So something similar to that. Maybe I want to use it for my front-end code base. Single page equals to single toner level. Example, toner equals to 100, printed page equals to 20, updated toner equals to 80. So every page that you print, right, so toner should be coming down. So per page equals to a single digit of a toner. So if you print 100 pages, your toner is out of ink, right? So you want to make, you put the ink on your printer, so that's called toner. That's it, right? That's pretty much it, right? If toner reaches less than 1, then print low toner, please add more toner, right? So if the toner is less than 1 means it reached 0. So that means you need to make sure that, hey, add a little bit more toner for me. Then max pages can be printed 100. So we are also kind of writing some more logics here. It's a very interesting code base. So let's go through how I really want you to, do
you share
this.
text
Yes, I will.
slide?
I will. I will. Just give me a second. So here's how I want the code to look like at the end.
Shows the other pages though.
Yeah, right. Um, it's there is no final grades here. Okay, the only way I see the success here if you get a job or not, right? So it's about practicing. It's not about solving, getting it right, so to speak. Um, I told that to my friends who copied from me all in college, right? Let's just practice. Let's not copy. But they won't listen. So you have what was that?
Did they get jobs?
No, not all of them. So printer, I mean, soon as the point you think the degree will get you a job, that's the most illusional thing you can ever have, right? Degree does not get you a job, right? So, huh? When was the last time someone ever got a job just because of like a degree? No, here's an accounting degree. I'll give you a job. So printer equals to new printer, right? And then I have a constructor that tells me toner level. You can set the toner level, right? So you can set it up to 100. So I set it to 40 for whatever weird reason. And then I want to also make a decision, hey, am I printing duplex or not, right? Duplex means both-sided, right? So I'm saying false here. And then I'm printing current toner level. And then I'm also printing get pages printed. I can add toner again. I added another 20 toner amount. And then I also print pages 20 here, print pages 30 here, right? And then I'm also printing out, again, the toner level and get pages printed, right? So can we guess what can be the output? You want to go? Rishi, right? Yeah, go ahead.
It's gonna be
10 what?
10. Owner amount.
Let's print out. So I have 4 values that's going to be printed. Can you guys guess what could be those values? All right. Let's try running it, right? So very first time when we ran it, right? Because we set the toner level, as long as it's 100, under 100, we'll let you set the toner level. If you go above or something, that's something else. But so if the toner level, very first time we initialize it at 40 and we are getting it for some reason, and then we see the toner level is 40, and then printer.get pages printed, right? Page count is 0 because we have not printed anything on that printer just yet. And then we added toner 20 to the existing toner, right? So then you see how get toner level turn into 60. And then we have print pages 20 and then print pages 30. So 50 pages that I have print, right? And then we've got total current print page count is 50, right? Now, however, if I change this to true, I should see these pages printed to what? 25, right? So and we also printing out saying, hey, printing in duplex mode, right? Printing on both sides. And again, the toner level kind of stayed at 60, but the pages count narrowed down to 25 because it's printing on both sides. So we don't need 50 total pages. So I'll share this code as well with you, right? Just to kind of get an understanding. But so requirement, do we all understand the requirement? Right? So let's try your best. Don't try to solve all problems at once. It's gonna take some time. But spend next hour and a half here. So you have some dedicated time to work on it, and then work over at home, and then we'll go over it in our next class. And again, you don't have to submit this work. It's kind of like classwork. So that's that. And this is your printer app. And if you want to work this as a group, that's also fine with me. If you want to work, I mean, I don't know. I guess you guys need to. Listen, Deepak is mean.
It's not me. Not anymore.
All right. Any questions from online? All right. Well, once you're done online, just send that to Deepak or myself, and we can review the code.
Default toner level is 100, yeah? Default toner level is 100.
I think so.
Because it's means to counting, yes? Current toner level is 60. 100 is minus 50. And
Yeah, but it's not, if you do both sided, I'm counting as one.
No, I mean toner level, not page count.
Toner level. What is the requirement? Let's go. Don't look at the output. Let's look at the requirement. User can set toner level range between 0 to 100. Toner level cannot be greater than 100. That's what I'm saying. You have to still set your toner level. But it cannot be like 101 or 102.
Yeah, but not default it's 100 or doesn't matter?
It doesn't matter. But you have to set it. It's a constructor. You cannot go past that.
Yeah, if you go results, you can go. How we get the 60?
Because I initially set 40 here,
Yeah.
and I added a 20 here.
And we use the 50. It means
We use a 50, but the printed both sides. If you print both sides, right? That means
no. I talk about toner level, not page.
right.
We have to, if we use the page minus.
Yes. Oh, actually, yes. You have to subtract it, but we did not print toner after. All right. So let's see. I see what you're saying. If it's still 60. Yes. So there is a bug. That's a good bug. What it is that if you're doing duplex, right? If you're doing duplex, it's not calculating. So that's fine. You can fix that. But that's a bug. It should come down. The toner level should come down as you print it. All right.
Okay. Or we can put the default for.
How you want to do it? That's
100.
fine.
100.
No, you don't have to explain it. But this is actual bug. So toner level should come down. Either both side or single side, toner level should be. Yeah. Yeah. Good job. All right.